They put like 3, 4, sometimes 5 guys on the floor who are skilled, can handle the ball, can dribble, and they find mismatches and they attack them, right? So that makes them really, and they're really good at that offensively. What that tends to do is it tends to make them a little bit small.
Welcome to another episode of the Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, your host. On this episode, I talked to Jeff Haley. He is a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Minnesota, and he is the founder of the site Hoop Math. Among other topics, we discuss the data and the insights that you can get from his site Hoop Math. We talk about his motivation for gathering this data, and that leads into a discussion of three-point defense. And then finally, we break down all the Final Four teams for 2023. The Football Analytics Show is brought to you by the Power Ranks Sports Betting Newsletter. This is a free service that strives to be three things. 1, valuable. 2, concise. 3, entertaining. Every Saturday, I send out a curated list of sports betting tips, analytics, and humor. To check it out, go to thepowerrank.com. That is my site for sports betting tips through data and analytics. Once again, that's thepowerrank.com. Joining me on this episode of the podcast is Jeff Haley. He is a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Minnesota, and he is the founder of Hoop Math. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Jeff, really want to know more about your story. Give us a little sense for your academic background and then how that led or did not lead you to starting Hoop Math.
Yeah, I mean, kind of how I got to where I'm at, right? So I've always really enjoyed basketball, and I grew up playing basketball, and I would say I was my basketball career is best summed up as I was an okay high school basketball player. And I've also always really been interested in kind of mathematics and using mathematics to kind of answer questions and take things apart. And so I ended up, going in and studying engineering and doing a PhD in engineering, and I kind of work currently as a R&D guy in the chemical industry. But sometime in, let's say, around 2011, I had actually just recently changed jobs, and I had a little bit of downtime, and I started kind of messing around, and really, actually, what I started doing was I started writing about college basketball on the internet. I started writing on one of the SB Nation team sites, and in that time period also started just sort of looking at basically for every college basketball game that is played, there's a play-by-play log that's generated, and it has a lot of information. Information seemed largely underutilized, but all of these logs exist. And so I just started looking at them and, playing around with it. Originally, like just hand counting things. And so what I ended up doing eventually was realizing that, hey, if you can take these logs, put them all together, parse them, and put them in a database, you can do various calculations and pull all sorts of interesting things out of them. And so the basis for, and I just decided, hey, what the heck, let's put it on the internet. So the basis for doing that, because this has been sitting on my computer for maybe a few months, just me playing with it, and that's the basis for the website Hoop Math that I created, that I think I probably went live with in maybe December of 2011. So it's been almost 12 years.
Awesome. So Jeff, where did you grow up?
I grew up mostly outside of Buffalo, New York. So I lived, in between Niagara Falls and Buffalo, and kind of grew up like watching and playing and basketball, and it was kind of my favorite thing. So
Absolutely.
that's sort of where I got into this, I guess.
And you played in high school there in Buffalo?
Yeah, I did. Like I said, I was good enough to play. I wasn't good enough to play
good.
At the next level, let's say.
Right.
My probably my brief brush with fame is sort of an embarrassing story where like I was dunked on pretty badly in a basketball game, and the photograph ended up in the Buffalo News. And so I got a lot of crap about that for a few weeks.
That's awesome. Who was it that dunked on you?
Oh, he's just some other guy. I mean, he wasn't like anyone of any note. The most famous person who ever dunked on me was there was a guy who he played at Villanova for a while named Eric Ebers, who was a Buffalo player. He's the most famous person I was dunked on. But everyone else who dunked on me was a no name like myself. So
Right. What position did you play?
I played. I was a big guy. So I'm like I'm by the standards of today, high school basketball, I'd be considered an undersized big guy. But I played the post.
Okay. Excellent. And then you went off to the University of Texas. Is that correct?
Yes, yes,
For
yeah.
undergrad?
So I went there. Yeah, I mean, my father was transferred to Texas, and so I started looking there for in-state tuition because, frankly, the universities are quite good.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I did. Yeah, I did a bachelor's degree at the University of Texas, and I was there for, late '90s time frame, and
Yeah.
really enjoyed it. Became
Awesome.
a fan of the sports teams there during that time. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. I think we're about the same age because I went to Rice as an undergrad in the late
Okay.
90s. So, how did you end up going with chemical engineering?
Uh, I don't think I had put a whole lot of thought into it, to be frank. I knew I wanted to go study engineering to some form, and I ended up in chemical engineering, and I liked it.
Oh,
I liked chemistry and I liked math, so it made sense. But like that was about the extent of the thought I put into it.
yeah. I didn't put much thought into it either. I went to some college recruiting visit. I think it was Case Western. And I asked someone what the hardest engineering major is. And he said chemical engineering. I was like, okay, there you go. I'm done. We'll do that. Um, so yeah, so I ended up running off to the West Coast to get a PhD. What made you go up to Minnesota?
So I visited a few schools and I was kind of like debating between a few schools in California. I think probably most significantly, I was looking at really came down to like Berkeley and Minnesota. And I think the decision to go to Minnesota was, how it becomes like a very individual decision, very much like to some degree, like how much fun do you have, like your recruiting visit, and also like how much do you like the advisor that you potentially going to have, like how you get along with them and how you kind of see that relationship going. And so that was why I picked Minnesota, is I felt like I would have a really good, and I did, would have a really good experience there. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we always noted that you guys were always the number one ranked department in chemical engineering. So, and to have a good experience there is pretty awesome. I also spent some time at Berkeley, and I did not have a good experience with any of my mentors there. So,
okay.
we'll double down on your decision to go to Minnesota. Awesome. So, you told us a little bit about how you started Hoop Math 2011. Just the sport that you loved, getting into the data. Maybe give us a full sense for what you can get on Hoop Math in 2023.
Yeah, so the idea of the site is that okay, so like I think broadly speaking, we can look at a basketball game and we can say that like the outcome of the game is decided by a handful of things, right? And these are like well understood, well studied things. But one of those things, not certainly not the only thing, but one of those things is kind of shot distribution, what types of shots teams get, how they get them, when they get them, all of that. And I kind of built the site to help me better understand that and have found other people were interested in that information as well. So yeah, the types of information you're going to find on Hoop Math are going to be pieces of information really about the distribution of the types of shots teams take. So for example, when a shot goes up, it might be logged as a shot close to the basket, and so that'll be recorded, or a shot that's a mid-range shot or a three-pointer, right? So first it kind of divides all the shots into those types, and by each player and on each team it'll tell you kind of what their shooting percentages are from these various areas, how many of their shots come from these areas. The other thing it can look at is it'll look at like when in a possession shots take place. And here again, you can kind of extract this information from play-by-play data, where you'll look at information like, are teams taking shots early in a possession? And I've come up with a way to infer what's in transition and what's not from the play-by-play data. So you can tell, it'll tell you information, how many shots are coming in transition versus coming in the half court versus coming late in the shot clock, late in possessions. And then there's all sorts of other stuff like, okay, if a particular player has a certain number of assists, what percentage of those assists are coming in transition? What percentage are going to guys shooting a 3-pointer or the different types of things. So there's a lot of information about that. Likewise, it'll look at defense in a similar way, right? It shows what are the opponent's shots coming from, what spots on the floor, what kind of outcomes are those producing. So that's really, in a nutshell, that's really what the site does.
That's pretty awesome. When you look at this play-by-play data and it says like a shot at the rim, what's like the radius around the rim for that? Like if it's like those, any of those like 3 or 4 foot floaters that Gonzaga kept missing
So
against UConn.
yeah, so this is where things get a little tricky, right? Because there's actually a lot of complexity behind this question. Um, so actually, what will depend upon is the person who is logging the game. They're usually sitting there live, logging the game, and they have to make a decision on if a shot. In the old systems, it was they had to log shots as layups, dunks. So it was a layup, a dunk, a tip in, 2-point jump shot, which is from further away, or a 3-point jump shot. So those were the different the original categories. Now some of the teams have broadened out the categories a bit in terms of the software they use. But that was essentially it. That was kind of how it was decided. So it's going to depend, and in fact, there are some quirks in the data. Like there's a handful of places where it's gotten better. I feel like to some extent I've improved the quality of data collection because I've had some of these
Very
guys
nice.
contact me and tell me, "Oh crap! Now I see how I'm different from everyone else with your website." But in fact, the University of North Carolina and Iowa State for years were logging almost nothing as a layup. So
Oh wow.
so that created a weird quirk in the data, and someone was using my website and had written some article on ESPN.com about how North Carolina never gets anything at the rim, and then shortly after, like the official scorekeeper from the University of North Carolina contacted me, and we had a chat about these data and how they work. But I would say it's the long and short of that is I can only make I have the data I have to work with, and I used to go a little crazy about, oh well, the data quality not good or this or that. Now at this point, I've kind of just taken the philosophy that my goal is to, as faithfully as possible, reproduce the play-by-play logs. And periodically, I'll even have coaches reach out to me and who use the site who want me to correct something because there was an error in the play-by-play log, and they'll send me the corrected play-by-play log, and I put it in the database, and it goes fine. So it's pretty interesting. But yeah, this is a thing with play-by-play data. It's a thing with any of these data logging systems, frankly. Like there's going to be entry errors or judgment calls.
Yeah, of course. That's fascinating. So from what you just told me, it sounds like you're getting the data from the team sites, right? Like the
Yeah,
the websites from
yeah.
every athletic department.
I'm using the official play-by-play logs that are generated with the games, right? So every single college basketball game for at least a decade, maybe longer, has had one of these things, and
Sure.
I'm just using the same, like the official data.
Like how would have you ever checked what like ESPN does for layups as opposed to like the official?
So they're pulling the same data. I've
Oh, they are.
cross-checked. I've cross-checked everyone's
Uh,
data. Yeah, everyone's basically coming from the same source. Now the
okay.
difference is they might parse it through some sort of intermediate parser, but everyone's pulling the same data.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then kind of looking in the future, hoop math 2.0 or 3.0, do you have a sense for when we might get tracking data and then you can legitimately say, well, this layup was from 4 feet and maybe that's a 2 point jump shot or so on and so
Um,
forth?
my best guess for tracking data in college basketball is never. You have to keep in mind, right? There's like 360 some programs, and the
Yeah.
budgets for these programs is incredibly different, right? So there actually are a handful of schools that have tracking data, right? I think
Right.
like Marquette, for example. So anyone playing in an NBA arena actually already has tracking data, but
Mhm.
that's not very many programs. I believe a number of years ago, Duke sprung for the camera tracking system.
Right.
So I think my understanding is they've got it, but pretty much no one else. So like the most high resolution data that's generally accessible in college basketball are the synergy
Hmm.
the Synergy
Right.
Sports data, which is very interesting, but is very again, if someone has to log it, right? So they have freelancers who log these things, and I think the data are good, but they have kind of the same issue, right? You have someone
Sure.
has to do it. So
Right. 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 For sure. Right. And I presume synergy. Someone's like watching the broadcast, right? And saying,
yeah,
oh,
so
this.
it's either broadcast or it's coaching tape, right, for videos. So if you go in there, again, every single D1 program is in there, and Synergy is actually, if I was a basketball coach, I would 100% need that thing because it probably saves you 10 hours a week in just video editing alone. But it's every single D1 team, pretty much every game is logged, and then it's linked to video in that database. But so the numbers that are coming out of
Oh,
it are
cool.
based upon that. But really, I think the most useful thing of that tool is like if you want to go see every post touch that a player's had, in a season, and you want to watch them in 10 minutes, you can do it there, right? That's a very
Right.
useful
Right.
thing for a coach.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure it's a pretty expensive service. I didn't realize like there was a video component of that.
Yes, yeah, yeah. It's definitely not. I'm sure it's priced appropriately for what it is, but if you think about it, might if you were a small school, even though it's expensive for you, it's like it might save you. You might not have to hire a second guy to help cut video, right? I mean, it's that big of a time saver, I would imagine. So
Absolutely. So Jeff, your background as a basketball player, I presume, kind of inspired you to get into this much detail on the court, in terms of shots at the rim, 2-point jumpers, right? Because like you're into because you played. Would you say that's why you got into this nitty gritty?
yeah, maybe. I mean, I think I just get really into when I get into something, I'm a person who gets like really obsessed with like weird things. Like I went through a phase where I was really interested in learning about mushrooms, for example, and trying to grow them in my basement. So like
Nice.
if I go into something, I get into it is the best
Hmm.
way I can describe it. But yeah, I
Sure.
mean, I think in this case, I thought this was really, I wanted to use it as a tool to kind of understand the game and understand the game and how it's played, how it changes over time, and understand differences between teams and kind of like the diversity of really what most interests me is how decisions that coaches might make or the capabilities of particular players, like how that impacts the outcome on the floor. And so I felt like this was a tool to start to try and understand that, try and quantify some aspects of that. And so that's what really I tried to build it to do.
That's interesting, right? So, I mean, maybe an example of that would be like if a team takes a lot of 2-point jump shots or like a lot
Hmm.
of mid range jump shots, how does that affect their overall offensive efficiency by points per possession? Things like
Right,
that, right?
right. Stuff like that, or even stuff like, okay, so for example, what's the effect of playing a particular type of defense? And let's take an example of like, we're not seeing as many teams play it this year, but what I'll just like broadly call like the Bob Huggins defense, where like it's like people, and even West Virginia hasn't been playing this way the last couple of years, but essentially it's a defense where everyone plays like between their man and the ball and tries to deny everything. And what effect does that have on? Well, you can look. Obviously, that increases the number of turnovers.
Hmm.
That also has effect though on how many shots are at the rim because there's more back cuts
Yeah.
and there's more assists given up at the rim and there's more, um, and then there's more offensive rebounds because defenders are out of position. And so, looking at stuff like that and being able to answer the question of, okay, if you play this style of defense, or if you play, let's say, a defense like Virginia, like what will be the quantitative output of that? And that's the kind of question I think this data, plus some other things you pull from Ken Palm and things you pull from different sources, I think that's the kind of thing that you can answer. And that's actually the kind of thing where, at least with some coaches, I've been able to kind of put information together for in the past when I used to do more of like consulting with it.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in that kind of stuff. Or this particular player, his effect on the floor, he gets these sorts of shots, or he tends to create these types of shots for other people. Like that's the other piece I think that's very interesting. That if you have a very like detailed data set, you can go and start to understand.
Yeah. I love that a lot. Mostly because, you're talking about, I mean, the styles of defense like isn't in the data, right? Like you have to watch West Virginia
You have to watch it.
and
Yeah, yeah.
right. Um, okay. Yeah, and I love that, and you're using data to answer that question. So I have a question for you in that regard, right? I've been really fascinated with teams like Houston and San Diego State. So when you look at the data in general, you see a huge element of randomness and 3 point defense. So 3 point
Hmm.
field goal percentage allowed, and the simple thing to say is that, like, you see a team like Houston that's allowing less than 30% from three, you expect that to regress to the college basketball average of 34%. But of course, for Houston, it doesn't. I mean, they've
Nope.
consistently been better, and they do it by actually like allowing teams to shoot, right? Like there's some teams that don't allow you to shoot the three, and that's something that is actually pretty predictable. But that's not what Houston does. And I've also seen the same signature with San Diego State. So, do you have any sense for what they're doing?
So yeah, let's talk about that. So there is this sort of and Pomeroy wrote about this years ago. There's this idea that
Right.
defensive 3 point percentage is more or less like kind of a random number. And like that's mostly correct, but he pointed out, hey, but there are some exceptions. And at the time he pointed out Syracuse as an
Right.
exception. You give up a ton of 3 pointers, but teams have for very long time shot below average 3 point percentage for over many seasons. Or the other thing that you'll see is like Rick Pitino's teams have historically given up really low opponent 3 point percentages. San Diego State is a really good example of that. Um, Currently, they are, you look at it and it's like teams are shooting below 30% from three against them. And you're like, oh, that kind of sounds and feels like a fluke. Except you look and it's been that way every year since like Steve Fisher's
Right.
third year,
Right.
and so they've been doing that for a decade. So it's not a fluke at this point, right? So there's
Mhm.
different hypotheses as to why this is, right? So one thing you start to look at is, okay, well, are they really good at like taking away particular shooters? And I think to a degree they probably are, but hey, everyone's trying to do that. Um,
Mhm.
I think the best explanation I've heard for this is that teams that are generally good defensively, like San Diego State or like, Houston or like some of these other teams, they make everything so hard that teams are taking a lot of just low quality looks because that's the only shot they can take. And I think there's
Mhm.
probably something to that, particularly against
Sure.
Syracuse, where people are taking all these threes from like, they're taking all these threes from like when Syracuse was still like I'd say peak
Right.
of what they were. People are taking all these, 25-foot 3 point shots that were at least somewhat contested. And something you'll see in the data, if you go again in the synergy data, is individual players. It's hard to tell much because the sample size is so small. But if you look at the entire database in aggregate, there's a pretty they'll log shots as contested versus uncontested,
Hmm.
and the difference on shooting percentages is about 5%. So it's like 33%
Hmm.
to 38% roughly
Okay.
difference if the shot's contested or not. And let's just say that as a rule of thumb. So if you were better at contesting or better at forcing teams to just settle for bad shots because they can't get anything better, like the defensive 3 point percentage does go down. And that effect I think is real. Like there's
Sure.
obviously some noise and randomness from game to game, but that's a real effect.
For sure. And I remember, if I remember correctly, Ken talked about how 3 point defense and 2 point field goal percent defense are pretty strongly correlated, right? And I think that's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. If you're good, usually the teams that are good at 3 point defense are consistently year after year also good at 2 point defense because they're taking everything away, basically.
So what? So what's the difference for like a team like Michigan in the last years of the Beeline era when they were really good? They simply didn't let you shoot threes, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
like, how is that different? I guess that's the thing I don't quite understand, right? Because I guess it's a subtle difference, right?
yeah. I mean, I think so. So teams. So if you look at the way they were playing defense, and who was the assistant coach who they brought in to
Uh,
do this?
he went
Because
to Texas,
he spent a
right?
year at Texas and then he became a head coach. His name is escaping me. But yeah, and he completely retooled at Texas, changed the defense style as well. And there, what they were doing is they were just not helping off of shooters very much, right? So many, you think about where, and especially where high quality threes come. Like, so if you watch a college game, and this will show up in the data too, right? If you look at, so first of all, this is something that you can see if you look at hoop math, right? Most 3 pointers, something like 80% of 3 point shots, in college basketball, that's just a rough number, 80% of made threes are assisted. They almost always come off an assist, right? So it's very rarely a guy is dribbling and shoots a three and makes it. Um, so if you look at where good 3-point shots tend to come from, they tend to come from situations where like maybe there's a drive and kick, or a ball goes into the post and gets kicked out, and usually a defender's been helping off someone, and then they have to close out over a distance, and that's a situation where you've got an open 3-point shot, or a chance to shot fake and drive the basket, right? And so many teams, that's what they're trying to achieve on offense. They're trying to get as many of those situations as possible. And if you watched, Villanova play over the years, like their whole offense is get those situations to happen. So in those situations, you've got a pretty open look, right? What Michigan was doing in that time period was they weren't helping off those guys. Or another team that was playing that way was Wisconsin in the Bo Ryan era. They didn't help off of those guys. And then they made all of the rest of their defense work within that context. So if you're not helping off shooters, that means you have to guard the ball screen in a particular way. You either have to switch or drop. You can't play other coverages because you won't have the help you need to play those other coverages. So like the whole thing was, we're not going to help off of shooters, and we're going to let the chips fall where they may, covering individual players.
Right.
And it's a strategic bet, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but that's the bet they're making.
Right, for sure. And like obviously you can do that better if you have guards that can stop the dribble drive.
Exactly.
If you have a big guy that can block shots.
The basket. Yep.
Right.
Yep. Exactly.
And then you have teams like Gonzaga that have neither, and then they get into trouble sometimes. Fascinating. Okay, yeah, that helps a lot. That was the question I had. Obviously, I think you get a lot of good 3-point attempts off of offensive rebounds. Do you know like what fraction of attempts come off of offensive rebounds?
Oh, I haven't looked at that number in a long time. I wouldn't know that off the top of my head. I haven't run that one in a while. That's not like a standard one on my site. There certainly are off of offensive rebound goods. I mean, it's a similar situation, right? The defense is out of position, is scrambling. So I think off of low post touches, probably I would imagine offensive rebounds are similar, but actually the highest 3-point percentages, this is now a synergy kind of stat, not mine, but the highest 3-point percentages you get are actually off of kickouts from the low post, because the defense is the most out of position.
Even more so than off an offensive rebound.
Well, I don't know that they catalog offensive rebounds, so I don't in that way, because of the way their data is structured. It would not surprise me to learn it's a similar kind of situation, though, right? It's the same thing. Yeah. The big guy is kicking the ball out. Defense is totally out of position, so it's probably a good time.
And I presume for a team like Houston that traditionally has been pretty good rebounding, you're not going to get as many of those situations, and that helps lower their 3-point defense, I would presume.
Yeah, I think part of it is if you don't give up dribble penetration to start with, or you don't give up easy passes into the basket to start with,
for sure,
these things that collapse the defense and get guys, when guys have to close out, 15 feet or whatever, or close out from the paint out to the 3-point line, there's a lot of time to shoot. Whereas if that situation doesn't occur very often, then the types of 3-point shots you're taking are more contested. So my guess is, in many cases, if we were to look at these teams really, really carefully, we'd see stuff like that. The opportunities, they're good at just suppressing the opportunities entirely.
Yeah. I feel like from watching Houston this year, they're also pretty good at closing out.
Yeah.
Despite their lack of height.
They're good at a lot of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're good at a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Awesome. Jeff, would love to break down the last 4 teams remaining in the NCAA tournament. We have UConn. They've looked absolutely dominant. Anything in your numbers that you see special about this team? I'm kind of looking at Jordan Hawkins, and he's shooting like below average on 2-point jumpers, which is interesting because I think he's the best shooter in college basketball. I think he certainly has the best form of anyone in college basketball. But anyway, anything in the data that you see about UConn?
Well, I mean, I think UConn, the first thing about UConn is like they're good at so many things. But I feel like the thing really that the thing that kind of makes them go, in my view, is kind of like the way they pass the ball. And so you look at like, all right, so let's take the guy who's kind of like leading them in most offensive categories is the big guy Sanogo, right? He's just like a force inside. But if you look at it, like I pulled this number, so 60% of his points at the basket, scored around the basket, are coming off of assists. Another 13% are off of offensive rebounds. So it's not like he's sitting there and he's posting up, although some of it's like very deep seals and someone gets him the ball and he quickly scores. Um, if you then look at, he's just an indication, like for UConn as a whole, right? 50%, over 50%. So I got 53% of the baskets they've scored at the rim all season have been assisted, which is actually like the 14th highest number in Division One. So I mean, it's they shoot, obviously shoot very well. They obviously are great on defense. They rebound. They do pretty much everything well, which means they're probably, they're the obvious favorite for a reason. But the thing I think that's most impressive to watch when you watch them play is how they move and how they pass, and how they have several guys on the floor at all times who are playmakers and who can make these plays, and then a big guy who, when he gets the ball close to the rim, is just really hard to deal with. So it's going to be tough, I think, for anyone to beat them. I mean, short of, but it's one game, so anything can happen, kind of a deal. But they're quite good, and they're quite, I mean, it makes them fun to watch, right? Because the ball's flying around, and people are cutting and moving, and they have, a lot of players who are dangerous. So it makes them quite fun.
Absolutely. I feel like UConn has a lot of room for error, right? Like they don't have
Yes.
to play quite as well as they played the last 4 games to win this tournament. That's kind of the conclusion I'm coming to. I think this is a really dominant team,
Yeah, I
and
think that's a good way of putting it. Is like they can, all right. A lot of teams, you have an off night shooting the three, and you're just really in trouble. They can have an off night shooting the three and still possibly win by 10, because they've got so many other things going for them.
right, absolutely. And I feel like I kind of like the favorite Alabama last weekend, and they lost to San Diego State, but I feel like a part of that was like they weren't passing the ball. There was so much one
Hmm.
on one in the second half, and obviously that can happen to any team. You get down, you start stressing, whatever. I don't know what sense you have that that could possibly happen to UConn because they are a pretty good passing team, and I've certainly seen that in the games that I've seen. But I feel like that is something that like a lot of things would have to go wrong, right? They'd have to
Yeah,
do a lot of things out of character.
for them, I mean, they've certainly lost games, right? And teams like Marquette and stuff earlier in the Big East tournament were able to kind of disrupt. I think if you can kind of like bust up their sets, like they run a lot of off ball screening action and stuff, and so, and what I'm about to say, easier said than done, by the way. But if you're able to kind of like bust up their sets and kind of mess with their movement and action and the ball movement, then you might be able to kind of force them to do more ISO. I mean, but it's Alabama's different in that Alabama was playing really, really fast, and they usually run a ball screen and then swing it to someone, and that person has to make a play. So, like, getting Alabama to ISO and into these sort of ISO one-on-one situations, which is usually an advantage for the defense, it's like probably a cleaner path than UConn just because of the way they play, right?
Yeah, for sure. No, it's fascinating. If a team is going to disrupt UConn in their sets, I'm not necessarily seeing that in Miami, a team that has really struggled on defense. I don't know what your numbers say about like they're definitely the worst defensive team in this Final Four.
For sure.
Pretty bad overall when you look at my numbers or Ken Palm or whatever. Would you agree with that? And what else
Yeah.
do you see about this
Well,
Miami team?
so I mean, I think there's a sensible explanation here, right? Like, so what the thing that makes Miami so good on offense is they actually can play like a lot of isolation basketball very efficiently. Like they beat Texas over the head with it last week, and they put like three, four, sometimes five guys on the floor who are skilled, can handle the ball, can dribble, and they find mismatches and they attack them, right? So that makes them really, and they're really good at that offensively. What that tends to do is it tends to make them a little bit small. And at least in college basketball, I can't say in the NBA because the rules are different and things are a little different in the way the game's played there. But in college basketball, where you can have a big guy just camp out in the paint defensively and he doesn't have to move and he can just stand in front of the rim, having some big guys is quite helpful. And it really does kind of make your defense a lot better. So if you look at Miami's numbers, right? And here's something I pulled. If you look at their defensive numbers overall, yeah, their defense is not great. But specifically, if you look around the basket, so I would say they're roughly around Division One average in terms of both the percentage of shots they give up near the rim, and also what people are shooting around the rim against them. Right. So teams are shooting about 60% at the rim. That's about D1 average. It's been about that way for at least the whole time I've been tracking, which is now 12 or 13 years. Um, which usually Final Four teams are are better than that. But usually, to get to that, you usually either have to have a situation where you have a big guy, right? Teams with a really good defensive big guy, that number, that 60%, a great defensive big guy can turn that 60% field goal percentage at the rim to 50% field goal percentage at the rim, which is a massive effect. The other thing is Miami doesn't really keep the ball away from the basket. So there are teams that can work around not having great shot blockers by setting up their defense such that they just don't give up much penetration. But Miami's not like that. Now, the caveat being, Texas didn't really get to the basket against them at all. So I think that might have more to do with Texas and less to do with Miami. But it was a thing, right? Like so in that game, their defense held up okay, and they scored like crazy. I think for UConn though, the size inside on UConn is going to be a problem. We'll see if Miami can make them pay enough at the other end by making, Sonogo guard a 6'7" guy who can take him off the dribble. Right? We'll see. We'll see if Miami can make him pay enough on the other end. But I would bet on the team with the guy who's really big that no one can guard.
Right, exactly. Was Texas the type of team all year that was able to get to the basket?
No, they're really a jump shooting team. I mean, they were like if you look at their players, like their top offensive players were like Marcus Carr, Timmy Allen, Serge Jabari Rice. These guys were guys who mostly were shooters, or mid range, even like a lot of mid range shooters. And they were the thing to their credit is they shot a lot of mid-range shots, which okay, analytics says that's bad, but they shot a lot of mid-range shots at a pretty high percentage. So as an analytics guy, I'm not so sure that's that bad because I know that in any given game, even the very best teams at avoiding mid-range shots are still going to take like a quarter of their shots from the mid-range, and if you can shoot a higher percentage on those, it's got some value.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Jeff, let's go over to the other side of the bracket.
Sure.
Florida Atlantics look terrific. They're playing 9 different guys. Based on my data, they're not elite on either offense or defense, but they're pretty good on both sides of the ball. Any insights on this FAU team?
So this is a team, now I just talked about the mid-range. This is a team that's probably one of the most extreme teams I can find in the whole database of all Division One teams in terms of both avoiding mid-range shots on their end and getting their opponent to take mid-range shots. So they, on offense, only 15% of their shots were logged in the play-by-play databases, either being, we'll call them 2-point jumpers or mid-range shots, right? So everything else was either a layup, a dunk, a tip in, or a 3-pointer. So 15% is a really low percentage that puts them, they were number 13 in all of Division One for that stat. So like if you think about it, that's like they're
Right.
probably as extreme as you can go and still be able to play, right? Eventually you do have to take a shot in every possession or else you
Right.
turn it over.
Right.
On the defensive end, it's exactly the opposite. Their opponents took 38% of their shots from as 2-point jumpers, which is number 22 in the country. So like that's what I mean is in terms of someone who's like if you've structured, it's unusual to see this, but they seem like they've almost structured their whole approach and we're not going to take mid-range shots and we're going to try and force the other team, we're going to take everything but mid-range shots away from the other guys. So does that how much does that help you, right? I mean that's worth something, right? That has some value. I also will say that like in the whole basketball analytics world we kind of get a little bit maybe myopically obsessed with shot distribution, and I have to kind
Sure.
of apologize that I may, the small role I've played in that with a website that's totally focused on shot distribution, I want to apologize for, because things like offensive rebounds and turnovers matter. And at least at the college basketball level and every level below that, they probably matter more than the perfect shot distribution.
Yeah. No, for
So,
sure. Yeah.
but these guys are really good at making sure that they get the kinds of shots they want and making sure their opponents don't. So, like,
Yeah.
they deserve some credit for that because if nothing else, like, one thing about like coaching is it's one thing to say I want to be able to do this, but then to be able to actually achieve it is different, right? So
Yeah.
they're actually able to achieve something that's considered in many cases like a good objective for a basketball strategy.
Yeah, for sure. And that must come from coaching, right? Their
Yeah,
ability to do that.
absolutely. I mean, I've certainly talked with coaches who were obsessed with avoiding mid-range shots. They tend to gravitate towards me, and because and there was a former D1 coach. He coached at a couple different places. He's currently not a head coach, but he and I got to know each other pretty well. And basically, like everyone on his team had the green light to shoot a three, but only like one or two players had the green light to shoot a 2-point jump shot. Like that was his rule. And that was how he did it.
Yeah.
So like they shot
Right.
tons and tons of threes, including guys who maybe shouldn't have been taking those, but no
Right.
one shot mid-range shots. On the
Right. Right.
defense, I think it's a little trickier how you actually implement that. Like you have to be
Sure.
pretty disciplined about taking away drives and pretty disciplined about how you're going to close out on shooters and stuff like that. And I think again, you have to almost, I mean, if in their case, I think they're picking more taking away the rim. But if you
Right.
aggressively take away threes or aggressively take away the rim, you're going to probably skew the other team to taking more mid-range jumpers.
Yep. I have a good shot distribution story for you. John Beeline is my neighbor, so
Oh, okay,
I will
cool.
see him. Yeah, it's awesome. I'll see him out on walks and stuff like that. And
Oh, yeah,
I will.
great.
I saw him after the Cleveland Cavs gig, and I don't know if he knows my name, but he knows I'm like the tall Asian guy in the neighborhood that does
Okay,
analytics, right? And so we're just chatting, and he's like, "Yeah, all these analytics people were telling me like mid-range jump shot is like not worth it." And then we go out there, and then Kawhi Leonard kills us with 15-foot jump shots.
yeah. Well, a great player doesn't really like the rules don't
Right,
quite apply, right?
right, of course.
Yeah. So my connection with Beeline. So Beeline's a Buffalo guy, right? He's from
Yeah.
Buffalo. Um, so actually, John Beeline, I used to attend his camps
Oh,
when I
cool.
was in high school,
Right.
and it was actually one of the better camps in terms of like he fixed my free throw shot one year, and so my free throw percentage I became like an 80% free throw shooter after going to his camp one year.
That sounds like John
But
Beeline.
he's a good
Quintessential
coach.
Beeline.
He's a good coach, and actually he actually played for the same high school basketball coach that I did, although there were many years in between.
Right.
Um, so yeah, no, I can't say I know him that well. I've met him a few times. I've definitely been to his camps, and like he's an excellent basketball coach in terms of teaching people how to play basketball.
Yeah, he's probably better human being too, which I think is the special thing about him, how he interacts with his kids. But I would definitely agree with that. All right, Jeff, let's move on to San Diego State.
Sure.
This is a team that I know is obviously great defensively. We've talked about that a little bit already with their 3-point defense. I'm not convinced about this team at all on the offensive side of the ball. So break this team down for me.
Yeah, they're not the best offensive team. I mean, this is a program that really like if I don't know if I think of who are the programs that were hurt most by COVID, I'd say this program and Dayton, right? Because both those teams that year were awesome,
Yeah,
and
they
they
had
didn't get to play
superstars.
because they had because at that point San Diego State was really good on both ends of the floor. I would say now, I mean, they're obviously better defensively than they are offensively. They still do have some players, but yeah, the other thing about them, right? They take away three-pointers. They also block a lot of shots, and they're tough around the basket. So it's back to the whole they're not giving up a high percentage on three because they're not giving up very much of anything. They're tough to score on around the rim. They have the second highest of if we look at the Final Four team, the team with the highest percent of shots at the rim that they block is UConn. Not surprisingly, given the size they have inside. But these guys are just somewhat behind them, right? So almost 14% of opponent shots at the rim are blocked by San Diego State. So that's a pretty good number. That's pretty good. That's not like Kansas Jeff Withey good, which was like I think 20% or something. But that's a good number. And so they'll make everything very very difficult for whoever they end up playing, right? Like for FAU, and if they advance for UConn or for Miami, right? So it's they're they're no fun to play against. I think is probably the best way I'll describe them.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Do they have enough offense to get past FAU?
I think they could. Yeah, I mean, it's it's so hard to say, right? I don't have a great feel for this game between these two teams, one way or the other, because I haven't like, unlike with UConn and Miami and some of these other teams where I've watched them throughout the year, I've really only seen these two teams play like a few times in the NCAA tournament. So it's a different kind of. I don't have as great of a feel for them. Like I can look at the data and stuff and tell you what stands out in the data, which is these sorts of defensive things, but in terms of who's going to win, I mean, I don't know. I'd look at. I'm not the guy who predicts outcomes, right? So I'd ask you that question. Who do you think's going to win?
I don't know. I mean, my numbers say San Diego State. I just don't buy this team, and I don't have a great feel for them either. But from what I've seen, and maybe this is just my bias, but I feel like they're making a bunch of contested 2 point jump shots to get this far, and they're clearly
Hmm.
great on defense. And I mean, I try not to go against my numbers, but I would not be surprised if I like what I see from FAU, except when they decided to run with Fairleigh Dickinson in the round of 32
Hmm.
instead of throwing it down to the big guy.
Hmm.
Um, so I don't know. I mean, I kind of expect to see FAU and UConn in the final, but so Jeff, before we get into the non potentially non sports stuff, I want to ask you about Texas. You're an alum. This is a
Yeah.
team that has looked incredible in the numbers for most of the year. It was a team that I didn't particularly trust to go that far. I just didn't see like an alpha player that could help them get over the top. And obviously, a tough situation with Chris Beard getting fired and the situation surrounding that. Rodney Terry taking over as an interim. Now he's the head coach. So maybe give me your perspective on the Texas program.
Yeah. I mean, like let's set aside the Chris Beard aspect, right? Because that's kind of its own thing. We can chat about that certainly if you like. Um, but if you just look at kind of the results of the team, which all right, whatever Chris Beard did is not the player's fault. If you look at the results of the team, it's the best basketball season that Texas has had in quite some time, right? So, I mean, an alum and someone who watches all the games and follows the team closely, I mean, it was a fun year, right? It was a
Yeah.
probably the most fun I've had following this team since I don't know DJ Augustin was playing there, So
Mm-hmm.
like the probably the most recent year that was this good would have been the year that DJ Augustin was there, and 2009 season, right? So
Okay.
that's been over a decade. So yeah, no, I think it was a fun year. It was a fun year.
And then, I mean, what do we expect in the future with Rodney Terry getting the job? I mean,
I,
is it going
I
to
have no
continue to be
idea. I mean,
okay?
I think I can say that though. I think so. The thing I've kind of like learned from these, because Texas had the same coach for many many years. They had Rick Barnes for many years, and
Sure.
before that they had Tom Penders for a number of years. And so now in the past decade, the university's gone through a few different coaching changes, and they go out and they hire someone who everyone loves, and it doesn't
Hmm.
go very well. And then they go out and hire someone else that everyone thinks is great, and it doesn't go well for a different reason, right? So
Right.
um, I don't know that I can necessarily predict who's going to do well and who's not going to do well.
Right.
I think you can look at Terry's past record as a head coach at Fresno State and UTEP, and you can say like, he did all right. Like
Hmm.
he didn't set the world on fire. He wasn't also terrible. His team seemed to improve over time. He definitely brought good players into those programs. He definitely found talent, and I suspect that's I suspect he'll definitely have talented players on his team. How the whole thing fits together and goes together remains to be seen. But like, I don't know if you have good players, there's a chance it works, right? Because that
Sure.
if you don't have good players, it's going to be a rough time. I know that much.
Yes.
So I think it has a chance. I think it has a chance of working. We'll see.
Yeah. Would you have fired Rick Barnes?
I was like, I was kind of, at the time I was writing about Texas basketball, and I think I was the last person on the internet to want to fire Rick Barnes. I was totally in the bag for Rick Barnes. I still am. There's a
Yeah.
little,
Okay.
yeah, I've got a little like scrapbook and everything. So, I'm probably not the right person to ask. I probably would
No,
have
that's.
stuck with him,
I feel like.
just because I think the things that he knew how to do before, it's not like he had lost those things. Now, maybe there's an argument that a little change of scenery did him well.
Sure.
It
Yeah.
certainly doesn't seem to have hurt. and
Right.
we all sometimes need a little kind of to change things up a little bit, right? To kind of
Right.
refine whatever was working for us before. But I don't know. I think if he was still there, they'd still be good.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I definitely, I think a lot of the numbers guys respect what he's done, and you look at what he's doing with Tennessee and the quality of teams that he's putting up there. I kind of feel it's somewhat similar to Andy Reid. I grew up in Philadelphia, Eagles fan, and just kind of lost it when they had to part ways. But maybe it was good for both
Yeah.
sides.
Well, I guess the similarity there is like the thing, what we kind of take for granted is like what happens is, and this happens not just to these guys, but it'll happen to many coaches, right? Is that they have a level of success
Hmm.
and maybe a pretty high level of success, and then that kind of resets expectations. And then
Right.
if you don't continuously improve off that success, okay, that people start grumbling. Well,
Right.
we want someone who will take us the next step. What
Right.
happened to Rick Barnes is they actually took a slight step down for a few years, right? Where
Hmm.
they were no longer having the level of success they had. They were having, by the historical standards of the program, still good teams, but
Right.
so, I mean, you're going to lose the fan base when that happens. And I would say at Texas, they're relatively patient with the basketball coach, not so much with the football coach, but they're relatively patient with the basketball coach. But at a certain point, all right, the guy'd been here long enough. I think he just kind of lost most of the support of the alumni and fan base.
Yeah.
But I was still in his corner, I promise.
No, I believe you. I believe you. All right, Jeff. I love to end the show with some potentially non-sports questions.
Sure.
What's your favorite book?
That's a tricky question. I mean, I guess that you had sent this over, and I was trying to think, like, and I was like, oddly enough, I'm probably going to go with a cookbook, and if only because I really enjoy cooking. It's something I like to do. I've always done. I've done, since I was in college, and I feel like I can read a book and enjoy it, and I do, but like something where it changes the way I cook, kind of improves the quality of my life in a way that a regular book won't do. So I'm just looking at my shelf here. I think I have this book. It came out in I want to say around 2001, 2002. It was a gift from my girlfriend at the time, who I'm now married to, my wife, called "Glorious French Food" by James Peterson. I've used this book for many years, and I kind of like it. So like, let's just go with that.
Glorious French Cooking. Is that?
It's called "Glorious French Food," I believe is the neighborhood name of the book. Yeah, it's like 800 pages long. It's very dense. It's got a lot of like stories from his life. I mean,
Yeah,
it's pretty well done. It's
that's awesome.
enjoyable. But I don't know. I can certainly recommend a lot of cookbooks, but that one's a good one. I don't know that it's still being in print at this point, but it's a good one.
So my impression is that the French make such good food because they spend 3 days making a sauce. Is that roughly right, or what? Like what's like
There's
something
some
that
of
you've
that and
done?
some of that not, right? I mean, so what I would say is like from learning how to cook, there are certain things that can be done relatively quickly, certain things that can't be done relatively quickly, but ultimately like you can have, like you can have sauces, you can make sauces quickly. You can make them, you can also take a long time making them. I would say most of the ones I make are done relatively quickly because I'm a busy person. But yeah, I mean, it's it's an interesting thing because it's like we have, the book's really good at, and a few other books I have are really good at kind of laying out like here's why the cuisine is this way, right? And in French food, you kind of have like three types of cooking, right? So you have the type of cooking people do at home, which okay, that's going to be, it can be really good. It's going to be more like utilitarian and more, less fancy. Then you had like this sort of really highbrow cooking that was designed for the kings or the monarchy, and then when after the French Revolution, everyone opened up. These guys all went and opened up fancy restaurants, right? And that's sometimes what we think of, and that's frankly for the most part inaccessible if you're cooking. And then you have something kind of in between, which is like kind of like basically nice home cooking. And then you have restaurants that are sort of in that category as well. And I think, yeah, I think it's the two lower tiers, not the what the not what the king was eating, but the two lower tiers that are probably a little bit more practical for most of us who um, are cooking for ourselves, not cooking all day as a job for a monarch.
Yeah. What is the best thing that you've made from that book?
Oh man, I can't
Or just
remember,
give me
but I can
one.
definitely tell you the worst. Um,
Okay.
because it is memorable, and it's not because of it's because I messed up. We had my wife and I had gone to or we were in Quebec City, and we had
Nice.
had duck liver mousse, and we're like, this is great. I'm like, all right, let's go home and make something like that. And so I was living in the time in the Toronto. I was a postdoc at the University of Toronto, and I went down to the store, and we had this like really nice like Chinese supermarket on the first floor of our building. We did most of our shopping there, and I went in there and I bought some chicken livers, and I brought them up, and I like got the book out, and I read how to do it, and I went and I seared the chicken livers in the pan, and I did all this stuff, and I prepared the cream and whipped it and made the mousse, and then we tried to eat it, and it was so awful. It was like we just had to leave the apartment right away. It was like I'm like, I just have to leave. Let's go. And we went to a Vietnamese restaurant like down the street, and that was our dinner because it was so bad. It was like you almost needed a biohazard suit to like clean the dishes after that. I
What
did
happened?
this. So apparently, what happens is when you sear livers, like
Okay.
chicken livers or duck
Yeah.
livers or something like that, you have to sear them extremely hot, extremely quickly, I guess. And I didn't apparently execute on that very well. And the experience, if you don't, becomes just incredibly awful. It was texturally, flavor wise, it was just so off-putting and so terrible. It's really like it's probably the single worst thing I've ever prepared in my life.
Huh.
It's just funny how our brains work. Like I can't remember the nice things I've made, but I can definitely remember the horrible stuff.
Dude, you sound like a sports bettor.
I
Can't remember
know.
can't remember all the wins, and you remember that terrible beat.
I don't gamble on sports, but yeah, if I did, that'd be that way as well. Yeah, absolutely.
Um, I've seared chicken livers. I didn't feel like, I don't know. I just eat them. But
You probably did a better job than I did.
yeah, I just don't remember like needing it to. I don't know. Yeah, I think
Something
it's
went
great.
sideways and it was awful.
Yeah, I mean, I like cooking the chicken livers, right? Because like
Yeah, yeah,
my younger son will be like, yes, this is amazing, and then the other two people in my family will like run away.
sure, sure. They're
So
not for
you
everyone,
get it.
but
Yeah, definitely not for everyone. Definitely. All right. So as a cook and as a sounds like you're a foodie, Jeff. What's your best culinary experience?
I can think of a couple. I'll give you like so. I had the opportunity a number of years ago. It was really like I was at a conference and I was in San Sebastian, Spain, in the Basque Country, and then went and had a few really wonderful meals there. But the best one was in Bilbao in the Guggenheim Museum restaurant. I had a fantastic meal.
Oh wow.
But the other one that I'll remember probably the most, and it's because like every time I go and eat tacos, I'm like searching this taco. There's a particular. I had an El Pastor taco from a taco cart in a southern suburb of Mexico City. That was just like the best taco I've ever had in my life, and it's like
Nice.
like 13 years ago, and I still like think about that taco from time to time.
That's
So those
amazing.
are probably the most memorable food experiences.
What in the Basque Country? There's like the tapas are called something special. It's like mixtos or something.
Yeah, I can't remember exactly, but
There's like a name.
yeah,
Yeah.
the Basques are more, the Basques take the food much more seriously than a lot of the other parts of Spain, right?
Interesting.
They have their own cuisine. I mean, they're culturally a little bit different, right? They have their
Yep.
own cuisine. They obviously have this language that they're trying to learn again, right? Because it was
Mhm.
suppressed for so long, it's not many people can speak it, but they have their own like unique cuisine and culture, and they take the food. I would say like the some of the best food in Spain is going to be in the Basque Country.
Hmm. Interesting. We were just in Barcelona and
Okay.
we had some amazing food there. And the best were the restaurants that were like it was like going into a Catalan home and getting a home cooked meal.
Okay. Yeah. I mean,
It was amazing.
in Catalan, they also probably the best cuisines of Spain are the Basque and then the Catalan cuisines,
Right.
right? Like
Yeah.
those are
And
probably the best.
it was also kind of interesting too because I feel like I ate a lot of food that wasn't exceptional. Um so like I mean tapas in general are pretty good, but there were a lot of places where look, this is good. But it wasn't exceptional. And we actually
No,
really
it's
had to dig for the exceptional.
Yeah, I mean, tapas, it's like you're gonna go and have like you find a place they have like the nice ham, and you get some
Oh,
like anchovies and stuff like that. And it's gonna be like it's not gonna blow your mind, but it can be pretty nice.
yeah. Well, okay. So the ham, so jamon iberico is the greatest thing ever.
Oh no,
It's
it's very good.
it's
It's very
it's
good.
yeah. So that I did not have bad jamon iberico. That was awesome,
Yeah,
and me
yeah.
and my younger son are like kind of obsessed about it now.
Okay.
We ate a lot of it, and we actually I kind of remembered in the middle of the trip, and I was like, oh yeah, there's that thing where the pigs only eat acorns, and they have to be a certain breed, and so on and so
Mm-hmm.
forth, and then it kind of hit me. I was like, oh, you know that sandwich we had yesterday? That must have been jamon iberico, and that turned out to be correct because
Yes.
once you know
Yeah.
that jamon iberico exists, then it's not very hard to find in
No, no, no.
Barcelona.
It's
It's
it's it's all
amazing,
over the
and
place. It's all
yeah.
over the place. Everyone's got that leg hanging from the corner of the
Well,
bar, and
yeah, but a lot of those aren't iberico, right? Because there's a
no,
lot
not
of
all
jamon that's
many of those are
yeah.
not. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But those can be
So
quite good too.
oh, for sure, for sure,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
that's amazing stuff. All right, Jeff, if you could have dinner with any one person, dead or alive, who would it
Oh
be?
man. Yeah, this one's tough because I was kind of thinking, I'm like, all right, who would I want to talk to? You start thinking of like these interesting historical figures. And I'm like, oh, Socrates. But then I'm like, no, they kind of put Socrates to death because he was really annoying. So like, probably not him. So I'm gonna go like much more mundane. And since we were talking about college basketball, I'm gonna pick probably the college basketball coach who I think be the most fun person to have dinner with, which is
Awesome,
easily Bob Huggins.
awesome. Why?
I think he would have hilarious stories.
Right.
I think he would just be fun and entertaining. He is supposedly has hilarious stories. I've never spoken with him, but I think he would be a fun. I think he would be a fun guy to have dinner with.
My understanding is that he just goes to and hangs out at people's homes and drinks a Bud Light there in West Virginia, and right.
Yeah, yeah. I think he's a pretty like normal dude, but my understanding is he's hilarious. So
Yeah, it'd be awesome. Jeff Haley, thank you so much for
yeah,
joining me on the podcast. Please let everyone know where they can get your work on the internet.
yeah. So the website is hoop-math.com. But if you just type hoop math into Google, it'll come up. It's like going to be one of the first hits. There's not too many other people. There used to be some guy who had like a website that did like elementary school math lessons and used hula hoops, and his website was a variation of hoop math too. But I haven't seen that guy in the Google searches in a while. So if you Google hoop math, it'll come up pretty quickly.
Awesome. Someone stole Hoop Math on Twitter from you though, so please give everyone
Oh,
your
did they? I've never really. My Twitter account is Jeff C Haley. It's at JEFFCHALEY. I've never even looked for the Hoop Math Twitter account
well.
if it exists or.
I was trying to find you on Twitter, just searching Hoop Math, and I was like, oh, that's not this is not right. You have a lot of great tweets and stuff, so if you guys enjoyed this interview, please follow Jeff on Twitter. And Jeff, thanks again.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for having me on.
My name is Ed Fang, your host for the Football Analytics Show. I'm honored that you listened all the way to the end of this episode on college basketball analytics. I really hope you enjoyed all of Jeff's insights as much as I did. I really enjoyed talking to him about everything from three-point defense to Florida Atlantic and everything else about the Final Four. Just a reminder, you can get my free sports betting newsletter. Every Saturday, I send out my curated list of sports betting tips. You can get that at thepowerrank.com. The Football Analytics Show is also supported by listeners like you. Thank you to all the kind and generous people who donate through Patreon. If you would like to donate through Patreon and support this podcast, I would greatly appreciate it. Patrons of the podcast get a patron-only episode every month. This month's episode talks about the wisdom of crowds, and I'll lead in with the inspiration behind that, which was college basketball, and we'll get some Final Four insights. But the really good part of that episode is about the application to the NFL and just how good preseason numbers are in football. To check that out, you can go to patreon.com/footballanalytics. Patreon is Patreon. Football Analytics is all one word. Once again, my name is Ed Fang. Thanks again for listening to this episode of the podcast, and I will talk to you again next week.